So in this lesson, we're going to pick up from the last lesson where we sort of touched upon some of the compositing nodes, but today is going to be focused pretty much entirely here so that we can create a final image for this set. And by the end of it, you should have a pretty good handle on the compositor and how to use it as a method for creating these effects. Now, as I said, we did touch on it a little bit in the last lesson. And so just to refresh your memory, this top window here is our UV image editor, and it's set to render result. We've selected the composite layer, which is basically everything combined, and the pass that we've selected is combined. Now, in the last lesson, we added a couple of nodes. Obviously, we've got this composite node. We've got this render layers node. We've got a mix node, and we've got an RGB node. Now, the nodes over here are input nodes. By hitting Shift A to bring up our menu, we can add a number of different types of nodes. I mentioned that these two over here are input nodes. You'll see that you can add in things like an image, a mask, movie clip, render layers, which is basically what we're using, and a bunch of other stuff, which we won't get into right now because these sorts of nodes don't really affect what we're going to be doing. As you saw, the output node is the composite, which is what we're looking at in the top screen there, as well as over here. We've also got things under color, which we will be using quite a bit, especially this mix node. Filters is something we're also going to be taking a look at, especially the glare filter. So let's take a look at what we've got. You'll see that we've got this render layer, and it's set to line work, which was one of the render layers that we had produced in the previous lesson. If we click on where it says line work, you can switch that over to shading, and automatically the image here in the UV editor changes to what is shading, because now this is running through the compositor. But you'll notice that a bunch of other little dots have appeared with words next to them, such as color, specular, shadow, AO, reflection, and emit. And these simply correspond to the passes that we had selected as passes that we want to use in our render. Now, each of these passes can be seen in your UV image editor, going over to shading, and under where it says combined, you can say, for instance, see what the AO pass looks like on its own without any other information. And similarly, things like shadow, which we'll be using quite a bit in this tutorial. There's also things like color information, specular highlights, our emission layer, which we'll be using as well, and so on. But that's basically what the render layer does. Your mix layer tells Blender how to combine your two layers that you are running through this particular node. Mix does more than just sort of mix one layer with another one. It allows us to pick a blend type, such as, for instance, add or subtract or multiply, burn, things like this. These operations you find in Photoshop quite a bit, and they can be used to great effect. Now, we don't really see much of what's going on because it's basically black over white, and so things like mix or multiply seem to work the best. We've got this button here, which we briefly touched on in the last tutorial, include alpha of second input in this operation. Now, because this line work actually has an alpha channel, you can see that sort of checkerboard pattern behind it. That's the alpha that we're applying. And if you don't have that on, it's going to disregard it and create an alpha channel that's basically the entire block of the image. And so for our purposes, we sort of want that on in this particular instance. Now, before I talk about clamp, I'm going to talk about the factor. Obviously, we haven't got anything added to the factor here, and we've got this factor which is set to 1. Now, the factor refers to how much of this image is mixed in this operation with this image. So if I was to say go to point 2, you can now see that we've actually faded out our lines to about 20%. The way you want to think about it is 0 is 0% and 1 is 100%. But you can actually dial in factor numbers that are greater than 1. And you can see that we get this very jagged looking line work because it's trying to overcompensate for what information is already there. Now, sometimes you want to increase the factor beyond 100% for certain effects. But if you ever want to sort of just drop that back down or not have that effect available in that particular node, this is where clamp comes in handy. And what this does, I can't really see it here, but in some instances, it will clamp your result to within a 0 to 1 range. So the way I like to approach my node setup system is pretty much how I like to approach my illustration. And that is, I want to work in the inks first, and then I want to apply color, and then finally effects. So they're the 3 steps that we're going to be going through in this lesson. Obviously, we've got some inks here, but inking goes beyond just the line work. It also includes some shadows. Now, the shadows, of course, don't live in this line work layer. They live in the shading layer. So let's try to maximize our real estate here a little bit. I might shrink this down a little bit because we really want to take a look at this compositor today. First thing we're going to do is we're going to select this RGB compositing node, hit X, and delete it. We're going to leave this multiply node for now because we will be using it very shortly. And to get the other node up, instead of just adding a node, making sure that this render layer is selected just by clicking on it, Shift D, and then it should automatically be selected with your mouse, and I'm just going to drag it up here and click. Now, nodes, unlike in the 3D viewer, they can just be clicked and dragged around, without invoking the G key or anything like that. So I'm going to click on this render layer over here, and where it says line work, I'm going to set that to shading so that our shadow pass is available to us. So you'll notice that on a node such as this multiply mix node, you've got some inputs, that's always on this side, and outputs always on this side. And the way they go together is, okay, so I want to take my shadow pass over here. So I'm going to click on where it says shadow, and I'm going to drag this orange line until it hits this dot here under image. Okay, and all of a sudden, we'll see that the line work, which we had already put onto this node, is now overlaid on the white spaces of the shadow node, including things like our lovely crease lines. Now this is okay, but what we've gone and done is just blocked out all of this lovely line work, the brick work and all of those details in there. And what I want to do is I want to get them back, but in reverse. I want to sort of see them etched out in white so that this very stark black and white image will still have a lot of texture. So how do we do that? Well, we sort of see how the shadow and image combines. So let's go ahead and add another node here. I'm going to go Shift A, and under color, I'm going to hit Mix. And what is it that we're going to want to mix? Well, first off, we know that our line work is in black, and we need that in white. So how can we reverse this? Well, we could go Shift A, color, and add an invert node, and then drag that until the line between image and image goes orange. And you can see that these white lines are now white. And we sort of have to overlay those on, let's see, the shading here, shadow, on these black areas, right? But here's a little secret. The alpha of your line work is already white. So we can use those lines without having to resort to adding an invert layer. So I'm going to bring this mix node here over the alpha line here, all right? And I'm going to leave that there for now. We need our shadow pass, so up here in shadows, I'm going to bring this down to image. And I'm going to change my blend type to add. And now we can see that white lines are sitting over the black spaces of our shadow. And so now we've got our whites on blacks running through two nodes here. So if you want to have a quick look at our node tree, it's beginning to get very complicated. You can draw out as many lines as you want from any of these passes for various purposes. Here, we've used the shadow mat to first off create line work over the white regions of the shadow mat. And we've also used it to create white lines over the black regions of the shadow mat. Now we have to combine them. So first off, what we're going to have to do is, obviously, we're going to have to add another mix node. So Shift A, Color, Mix, and I'm going to bring this over here. And I'm going to run the result of this node into the first socket here. I'm going to run the result of this node into our second socket here, and I'm going to run the image result into our compositing socket there. Okay. Nothing seems to have changed. We obviously have to do something about how this is mixed together, so add might be a good way to do it. Adding the alpha isn't really doing anything. What we have to do is tell this node to only add what's in the black area over this node. So what we need is somewhat of a map made from this shadow region, but with this area in black as white, because the factor works very much like an alpha channel. So what I'm going to do, let's go back to that, is add Shift A, our invert node. I'm just going to put this over here for now. And I'm going to run the shadow filter, color, move this over here, and I'm going to run that into the factor over here. And all of a sudden, we'll see that our black lines are now filling in our white spaces. Okay, so we've got white over black, black over white. Now, for me, this is a little bit intense. Okay, so there's a couple of ways we can knock back the white so that it doesn't overpower the black lines of our wonderful inks. We can go back to this layer, and by rolling this back, we can actually bring in our white lines to somewhere that approximates something that we could be comfortable using. And so I'm going to set that to something like 0.3. And so if we zoom in now, we can see that our black lines are there. We've got a little white etching, which is very difficult to get rid of because it uses, some of the shadows are in this brickwork as well. But you can sort of see that our crease lines are not affected. And that's looking really good. And so what I'm going to say is I'm going to say that that is our ink work done. So let's move our input layers over here. And let's just organize these layers in a way. I'm going to sort of collapse this invert layer a little bit. And I'm going to bring these down here. So with our inks completed, we now can move on to colors. Now, if you like to work very plainly, you can just basically add another mix node. You can bring in your color information and you can overlay your inks. Set it to multiply and you're done. But because we've got this wealth of information in all our passes, I mean, we've got reflections and ambient occlusion, specularity, even emission, I think we can do better than just these plain flat colors. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how I go about creating my color pass. So deleting that, I'm just going to go Shift A. Let's bring in a mix node here. And the first two passes that I'm going to mix are my color and my ambient occlusion. So let's see what that looks like. You can set it to multiply or darken or any other types of blend modes that you like, which mixes these color and AO. But the one that I have found works the nicest for comics is setting it to burn. Now, this is fairly intense, but if I reduce the factor to something like maybe about 0.75, now what we get is a color pass with a little bit of soft shading information with these lovely gradients here that still look a little bit realistic for comics, but I'm willing to let that go because I want some nice gradients in my particular colors. All right, so once I've done that, I'm going to mix in my reflection pass. Now, instead of adding another node layer, I'm just going to duplicate that. The fastest way to work is to just sort of duplicate it and drag it along the line here. I'm going to set this to value, and I'm going to bring in my reflection pass over here. Now, all of a sudden, you can see that the reflection pass just knocks everything out. And so we need to reduce this factor right down until we can sort of start to see that color information. Okay. Now, you can change it to something like add if you like, if you want some really stark reflections here. That's quite nice, actually. I'm going to go with add, and I'm going to sort of leave those reflections to about 0.7 because I quite like what that does. Now, keep in mind, an add blend type ignores all the blacks, and all the whites basically get added to it. Why don't we go ahead and add our specular pass to etch out some of these columns, because they're looking quite plain here. And this is already set to add, so let's just duplicate that, Shift D, drag that over here, and let's grab our specular information and bring that in. Okay, now we're starting to get some color information in this pass, which doesn't exactly look like our image here because this is much darker with everything combined. It looks a lot brighter. The gradients are a little bit more intense, and it's going to prove to be quite a nice bit of color information there. And so I'm sort of staggering these down so I can sort of see where all of these lines tend to go and what kind of operations we've got. Now I can sort of bump that right up so we get these really lovely stark specular highlights, liking that. So what we want to do now is bring in our inks, which are these nodes down here, and overlay them on our color. And we can simply duplicate this mix node again, set it to multiply because we want darks to really sort of sit over everything. And there you'll see that our inks have been applied over our color information, but where the color is showing through, we've got some really nice gradients, and we can even see some reflection information. This is beginning to look like an illustration. All right, so now about the emission layer. This is where we want to look at some effects. And the effect that I want to add, or the filter I want to add, I'm going to go Shift A down to filter, is the glare effect. So I'm just going to zoom in here so we can sort of see what we've got. Now, the glare is great because a lot of these filters have a few filters inbuilt into them, and it's by default set to streaks, but we're going to change that to fog glow, and you can see that all the dialog box changes a little bit. And we'll talk about these settings once we get our emission pass through there. So let's go emission to image. And let's connect the output of the glare node to the image here. And I'm sort of going to zoom in to this portion of the image up here so that we can play around with our fog glow and sort of see what it does. So we've got a few things here. Obviously, the glare type, which is set to fog glow. We've got the quality, low, medium, and high. I'm going to leave it on medium for now. We've got mix, and this is how it mixes together with the pass that you're running through it, or the image that you're running through it. We've got threshold, The glare filter will only be applied to pixels brighter than this value, and the threshold right now is set to maximum at 100%. And what we want to do to begin to see that glow is to drop the threshold, maybe not to 0, but something like maybe a 0.1 or something. And you can see that the lower the threshold, the more glow will be applied. So, for instance, 0 is all of our whites, and it sort of like gives us that wonderful glow effect. And of course, the size should be self-explanatory, but it maxes out at 9. And another thing about the size of the glow is that if we set the quality to low, yeah, we've got this sort of anti-aliasing here, but you can see that the glow really spreads out quite far. And we set it to high. The anti-aliasing around the edges is much crisper, but the glow is also fairly reduced, even though we've set this threshold right down to 0 and the size up to 9. Let's set that threshold to 1 here, sort of illustrate this a little bit better. So I actually like setting my quality to medium because 1, it renders a little bit faster, and 2, I can let go this sort of anti-aliasing because it's not so bad, but it allows for the glow to spread a little further out. And so that's just a little cheat for some of these glow settings, and this is looking quite lovely. But there's something else that I want to have glow in this image, and that is the specular highlights. So what I'm going to do is, on this line here that's going from the emission to the fog glow over here, I'm going to select an add node. I'm going to duplicate that. I'm going to bring that down here, and I'm going to put my emission layer on the bottom here, and I'm going to grab my specular pass and run it through there as well. And so now what we've got is bits of this tiled floor, which is very lovely, bits of these columns, really nice, and the glow from the windows sort of coming in as well, and that's working really nicely too. So I'm going to put that aside over here. And now what we want to do is we want to mix this glare over the entire image. Okay, so let's duplicate this, multiply. I'm just going to set that to mix. Set that image in there. See what our results are starting to look like here. And mix isn't doing anything. Maybe I've got to set this to add. Add's going to do it. There we go. Yes. Okay, so now the glow is being added to the overall image. And we can begin to see how that glow effect blows out over the darks of our inks. And that's what I really like. If we did that before we apply our inks, that ink is going to draw very stark lines over anything that glows. And that's not an effect that looks great. So there's a couple of final things we want to do, and that is we want to adjust some colors because this is still looking a little bit plain, but we've got some really nice reflections here. Maybe we can go back and bump that up a little. Maybe make those a little bit stronger. There we go. We've got some nice glows around the windows and the columns and everything like that. Maybe we want some overall glow, and then we want to do some color information. But there's another thing that I tend to like to do in a scene like this, and that is sunbeams. So this is another filter that is really fun to use. So I'm going to apply that first. So let's go Shift A, Filters, Sunbeams. I'm going to place that over here. Now remember that the only layer that we want sunbeams to work on is our emission layer. So we want this to basically be blurred in a particular direction as if sunbeams are streaming in through the window. It's not going to, look exactly right with the lighting because the lighting's sort of coming in this way, but it is going to add to it in ways that, it wouldn't have naturally added to it before. So first things first, we'll connect up the emission layer, which doesn't show up right away until we begin to add ray length to our sunbeams. So let's increase this a little bit here, And let's sort of play around with our sunbeams here. You can already see that our image, the source point, is set to dead center. And so you can imagine that 0.5 is right here. And the way it works is a little bit backwards. 0 on the X is around here, and 0 on the Y is around here too. And so as we increase the number along, you'll notice that it moves this way and that way along the X and Y axis. But first, let's add a ray. I'm going to go 0.1 just so we can see it. And there we go. There's a little bit of a blur. We've got this black dot here indicating where the sunbeam is emanating from. And we can see that our emission layer is blurred out from that radial point at this percentage of the image size. So the first thing we want to do is we want to move that black dot. You can sort of see it moving along here to that edge as if it's coming through here. And this is looking quite nice, but these ones not so much. And we want to move this up a little. Maybe we want to move this right over. Maybe we move this down a little so we've got more of the streaking. And maybe we increase these rays quite a bit more. Maybe we need to move that up. So these sunbeams could, we've got some holes in the walls, which is which is showing through over here. And now what we basically do is what we did with the glare, and that is duplicate this add node, connect this up, and our final image should have sunbeams composited. There we go. You can see that the sunbeams are now beaming through here. And we'll drop the factor by about 8, something like that. Okay, so now we're going to do two final things. One, I want an overall glow over the entire image. So I'm going to take my glow node, Shift D, and I'm going to bring it here to our final. But our threshold has been set very, very low. So everything's going to be very, very glowy, including these sunbeam effects. So I'm going to up that threshold to maybe something above 50%. I'm going to drop the size of the glow to maybe 8. That's looking quite nice, but now it's looking very kind of orangey, and I kind of want to bring in a bit more contrast. Let's see how these gradients are now starting to really contrast with all the overlays we've got going here. And so one final step is something that you do in something like Photoshop. So Shift A, color balance is usually my go-to. This works on lift, gamma, and gain. First off, I want to sort of pick a color. So I'm going to come over here to my gamma, and maybe let's see what happens if we drop it down to around this sort of orange. It's looking quite nice. The great thing about this is with your gamma, you can sort of pick a color. So if we wanted to say go to our blues and make this a very moody type blue thing, you can sort of begin to see that the shadows picked out here are beginning to look a lot more shifted into the blue area. You can also, pick almost any color you want, and it will begin to change the overall look of it. But I do want this to be a warm looking image, so I'm going to sort of set this to around the reds here. I'm going to click on that, and maybe I can work on some of this color to really let's drop the greens, the reds, the blues, right, until we get a nice color that we like. And then we can sort of shift the gain up or down to sort of really refine that. Now, you could pick different colors for everything else, and if you click on the color between the gain or the lift and use your eyedropper tool, you can basically color select that color, but it's not working out exactly right, although you're getting a really nice effect. And it's looking a little intense. So again, we can just sort of bring that factor down a little bit. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our final image with some nice sunbeams coming through the window, some nice intense glows on the more highlighted areas, some reflection on the floor, some inks, and some colors. Let's go take a quick look back at our render node tree. And now you can see how complicated this looks. But if you follow the steps along the way, you can very easily go in and we can trace these lines back. And at any time, we can sort of tweak in some settings. So let's say we want to maybe bump those reflections up a little bit more. We see where the reflection's going and where it's added into our node tree, and maybe bump that up to something like 0.9. It renders, and we can see that the reflections are bumped up a little bit higher in our image. Okay, so this finished example file will be available if you're a $3 patron. Bye for now, and thanks for watching.